What is at the rate qualifier annotation? Let us consider an example to understand at the rate qualifier annotation better. Suppose we have the interface called shape and there are two classes, rectangle and circle, that are implemented. This interface, we are auto varying our shape interface in our controller class using the at the rate auto var. Now now here are the conflict will happen. Public interface shape at the rate service class rectangle implement shape class circle implement shape at the rate test controller class shape controller at the rate auto var shape. Application failed due to a single bin required a single bin, but two were founded. At the rate service rectangle public implement shape and at the rate service circle implement shape. Okay. And you will use at the rate qualifier annotation to specify which bin should use at the rate test controller class shape control at the rate auto var at the rate qualifier circle shape. Now Spring will not get confused as to what bin it has to be auto var. You can also use at the rate qualifier annotation to give name to your rectangle and circle classes, like at the rate service qualifier rectangle public class rectangle implement shape. What is at the rate transactional annotation? Spring provides the declarative transactional management via transactional annotation. When a method is applied with at the rate transactional, then it will execute inside the database transaction. At the rate transactional annotation can be applied at the class level also. In that case, all the method of that class will be executed inside the database transaction. How at the rate transactional work? When at the rate transactional annotation is detected by the Spring, then it creates the proxy object around the actual bean object. So whenever the method annotated with at the rate transaction is called, the request first come to the proxy object, and this proxy object invoke the same method on the target bean. This proxy object can be supplied with the interceptor. Spring create a transactional interpreter and passes it to the generated proxy object. So when at the transaction annotated method is called, it get called on the proxy object first, which in turn invoke the transactional interceptor that begins the transaction. Then the proxy object call the actual method of the target bean. When the method is finished, the transactional interceptor commit or rollback the transaction. One thing to remember here is that the Spring wrap the bean in the proxy. The bean has no knowledge of it, so only the external call go through the proxy. As for the internal call at the transactional method calling the same bean method, they are called using this at the rate transactional annotation. The transaction propagation and isolation can be directly like at the transaction propagation is equal to propagation dot require new isolation dot read uncommitted rollback for exception dot class public string process return to success. Also you can specify the rollback for attribute and specify which exception type must cause the transaction rollback. A transactional with the runtime exception and error are by the default rollback. If you process the method is calling another bean method, then you can also annotate that method with at the rate transactional and set the propagation level to decide whether this method should execute in the same transaction or it is required new transaction. What is at the rate controller advice annotation? At the rate controller advice annotation is used to intercept and handle the exception thrown by the controller across the application. So it is global exception handler. You can also specify at the rate controller advice for the specific package. At the rate controller advice base package is equal to com.example.demo controller public class test or specific controller at the rate controller advice assignable type is equal to demo controller dot class public class test or even specific annotation at the rate controller advice annotation is equal to rest controller dot class public class test. Exception handler annotation is used to handle the specific exception thrown by the controller, like @controller advice, class test, exception handler, SQL exception class, public string handle exception, return null, exception handler, user not found exception dot class, string handler, handle user not found exception, return null. Here we have defined the global exception handler using @controller advice. If SQL exception gets thrown from the controller, then the handle SQL exception method will be called. In this method, you can customize the exception and send the particular error message or error code. Also, custom exception can be handled. If you don't want to create the global exception handler, then you can also define some exception handler method in the particular controller itself. What is bean annotation? Bean annotation is used when we want to explicitly declare and register the bean into the application context so that it will manage by the string. Some point to remember: when using bean, you have the control over the bean creation logic. Bean is the method level annotation. The body of the method contains the logic for creating the bean instance, and this method returns the instance which will register in the Spring application context. Using @bean, you can register the class from the third-party libraries into the application context. @bean annotation is usually declared in the configuration classes. Difference between component and @bean. Component auto detect and configure the bean using class path scanning, whereas bean explicitly declares the single bean rather than letting Spring do it automatically. Component is the class level annotation, whereas bean is the method level annotation. Component has different specialization called stereotype annotation, like controller, service, repository, whereas bean has no specialization. Bean let you create and configure the bean explicitly how you choose it to be, whereas the component Spring has the control. Bean let you configure classes from third-party libraries where you are not owner of the source code, but you can use component in this case. How do you profile in Spring Boot application? Every application has the unique environment like dev, stage, UAT, pre-prod, prod, and all the environment have the different configuration like database properties, port number, etc. In Spring Boot, we define all the properties in application properties file. But if we want to maintain the different profile, then we have the multiple application properties file for each environment, and at runtime we can specify which profile should be active. The profile can be created using syntax application profile name dot properties. For example, application dev properties, application UAT properties, application port properties, port for the production environment, UAT for UAT specific configuration, and dev for dev specific configuration. How to activate the particular profile? There are the many ways to activate a particular profile. One of them is by defining the property in the master application properties. Spring profile dot active is equal to UAT. We can also set the particular profile to be active by passing it as a virtual argument maven setting JVM system parameter environment variable. In XML, we can use bean profile UAT to activate the profile. There is a one profile annotation which, when applied to the component, tell that this component will be created only when the particular profile is set. What is REST template?